So it's working.
Thank you.
Yeah. May I
Do you
just
want
present
to
you?
introduce?
Yeah, okay. But in Slovenian, is that
Yes.
okay? Slovenščini? Ja. Se pravi, veliko veselje in čast mi je, da lahko predstavim našo novo dopisno članico, profesor Eleno Paoletti, znanstveno direktorico Inštituta za kopenske ekosisteme in iz tega ČNR-ja, italijanskega raziskovalnega centra iz Firenc. Ona je sicer tudi članica dveh teh italijanskih akademij, Gozdarske akademije in Gozdarskega združenja, ASIF in SISEF. Poleg tega je članica upravnega odbora Evropskega gozdarskega inštituta in zdaj je trenutno predsedujoča pri organizaciji svetovnega se pravi JUFRO gozdarskega kongresa v Štokholmu in izvoljena bo ravno kar za podpredsednico JUFRO, International Forest Research Organizations. Sicer pa je njena raziskave so v glavnem iz področja ekofiziologije, raziskav vplivov ozona na vegetacijo, sodelovala je pri vseh tehle evropskih tudi zakonodajnih postopkih za to, da se vključi ozon v monitoring in da se določi mejne vrednosti za ozon v kopenskih ekosistemih. Med drugim pa, če samo še omenim, ima H-indeks 64. Tako da z velikim veseljem predajam zdaj besedo profesor Eleni Paoletti.
Thank you, Aika, and thank you all for participating to this seminar. So we are talking about ozone. Ozone impacts on vegetation, in particular on forest, because ozone is a strong toxic gas, and of course we are talking about the tropospheric ozone, so the ozone here close to the surface of the earth, the ozone we breathe, and our plants also breathe. We are not talking about ozone in the stratosphere protecting us from the negative impacts of excess ultraviolet radiation. Ozone is also a greenhouse gas, and after CO2 and methane is the third greenhouse gas in terms of radiative forcing. But it's difficult to handle and to control because it's not emitted directly from the sources, but it's formed by reactions from precursors that are primary pollutants, such as nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, and others. So controlling ozone is still very difficult. As you can see, the interlinkages are quite complex. But this means basically that ozone is still an issue for people and for vegetation worldwide, although, of course, many control measures have been implemented. Here I'm showing the annual trends in summertime maximum daily 8-hour average, which is a metric to usually assess the impacts on people. And in this paper, we analyze more than 13,000 urban areas with more than 50,000 inhabitants worldwide. And basically, we found that there is a small decrease, 1-2% per year, in the period 2000-2019, in North America, Central Europe, and also some parts of Eastern Asia, which is very good news. But in other parts, unfortunately, ozone is still increasing in South America, Africa, and in particular, India and the Equator area. Also, if we run some models, the RCP models from the most optimistic to the most pessimistic scenarios, we see a lot of variability. going from a small decrease to a small increase in concentrations worldwide. And I'm afraid that the most pessimistic scenarios are the right ones, unfortunately. Ozone is also a strange pollutant because it is higher at remote sites rather than in the cities, in contrast to all the other pollutants, basically. Here I'm showing this very famous paper published in Nature many years ago, which was one of the first ones to show that the ozone concentrations were much higher outside New York City than inside the city. And this is because of several reasons. First of all, as I said, it's a secondary pollutant, so it takes some time to form from the emission of precursors, but mostly the cities are polluted by nitrogen monoxide in particular, and this is degrading ozone. So ozone is formed and degraded continuously. At remote sites, in contrast, there are many biogenic volatile organic compounds emitted by vegetation, and these are even more reactive than anthropogenic volatiles in stimulating ozone formation. So what we can see basically is that there is a reduction of the peaks of ozone in the last years, while the background levels are stable or even increasing. In the upper graphs, you see part of Mediterranean Europe, and in the lower graphs, you see some large cities in the United States and Europe. Interestingly, the control measures in the cities are reducing nitrogen oxide emissions, so that basically there is a convergence in ozone pollution, which is now high even in the cities. So to protect the vegetation, there are basically two kinds of metrics, those based only on how much ozone is in the air, and those based on how much ozone enters via the stomata, because ozone is toxic to plants only when it enters via these small pores on the leaf surfaces. For calculating the exposure-based indexes, in particular AOT40, which is the European standard to protect the plants, you just need to know how much ozone is in the air. But to calculate the flux-based index called POD, phytotoxic ozone dose, you need many variables. You see phenology, light, temperature, soil water content, and so on. So, however, we realize that it's very important to calculate the stomatal flux-based risk assessment, because if you use AOT40 or POD, you have very different figures for Europe. Recently, now it's in 2016, so it's 8 years ago, the National Emission Ceiling Directive was revised, and the Article 9 was added. And that's very important for us working with forest and ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, because in the past this directive just established a threshold of air pollutants not to be exceeded. So the emissions were to be below these thresholds. But now the NEC directive also implies that member states must monitor the impacts of pollutants on ecosystems. And this directive is the first one to cite the stomatal ozone flux critical levels. So there has been a lot of new science behind this revision of the NEC directive. Here we have 2 life projects of my group where we investigated how to actually monitor in the forest all the parameters that we need to calculate POD. We also record visible injury, diameter, subflow, and a number of other interesting parameters. But all these parameters and this risk assessment need a validation. And this validation may be done experimentally at artificial exposure systems. Here you see some examples. Usually they are closed chambers or open top chambers, but the most realistic system is the free air controlled exposure, the ozone phase. This is the phase in Freiburg set up by Rainer Matisek and in Freising. And unfortunately, the experiment now is over, but that technology was helpful to me to install a new phase system in Florence. At present, these are the facilities for ozone exposure in Europe, but most of them you see are closed chambers or open-top chambers or even greenhouses. The only free air experiment in Europe at present is in Florence. We have also an ozone phase in the United States, in China, in Japan, and one recently established in India. I still don't have the picture of. And this is an overview of the ozone phase. There are 3 levels of ozone. Each level is divided into 3 blocks. And we are very attractive because, as I said, there are few ozone phases in the world. And our phase is really working very well. We have ambient ozone, 1 times and twice ambient ozone, so 3 levels. The control is excellent, and we can, for instance, test, validate the symptoms, the visible foliar injury that we observe under field conditions. This is a test that we made with color palettes, but we are now working with artificial intelligence in order to develop a tool for recognizing the visible injury directly in the field by an app. And also we were able to put together the bunch of experiments that we made over the years, and we found that when visible ozone injury increased in the leaves, also the biomass losses, the relative biomass losses increase. And that's very important for risk assessment, because the risk assessment is based on biomass losses, which are very difficult, basically impossible to assess under field conditions, and rather visible foliar injury, it's easy to be assessed. So if we can convince the policymakers to make this change in the plant indicator, I think we can really work easier in our forests. For instance, this is an epidemiological derivation of flux-based critical levels based on visible ozone injury in European forest. So we have already applied this tool. Also at the ozone phase, we can parameterize the stomatal conductance model that's needed to define the species-specific critical levels, the species-specific POD. And basically, we now know a great deal about the negative impacts of ozone on vegetation. You see many growth, physiological and biochemical parameters are now well established. But there are still some knowledge gaps. One of the most important, I guess, is about the nutritional responses. And here I would like to thank Heike, because we were able to work with her and to apply her expertise to the analysis of the impacts of ozone in combination with nitrogen and phosphorus, 3 levels per each, on poplar. And we found actually that nitrogen fertilization for young poplar plantations may be not valuable when under ozone pollution, because nitrogen limitation for root growth is higher. This is due also to some anatomical changes in the fine roots that are the primary sources of soil nutrient uptake, of course. And here you see several parameters due to the xylem, the hydraulic conductivity, the vessel diameter and density that are subject to this regulation under elevated ozone. Similar responses were observed still in collaboration with HOICA in a great experiment with 3 types of oak species differing in water capacity, in water regulation capacity, and still we found root morphological changes, in particular the distribution of the fine root diameter classes was affected by ozone and water deficit in combination. And also here we found significant changes in root anatomy that can affect the capacity of plants to uptake water, and also can affect the isotopic relations. This is another paper we published with OICA, and so basically we found that no, ozone didn't affect carbon, and while it affected oxygen, because there is an impact on stomatal conductance due to the impact on photosynthetic capacity. Another gap, a major gap at present in our knowledge is about ozone impacts on biodiversity, and here you see we publish in Science Advances this review paper highlighting the main items needing more research. And interestingly, we were able to assess at the ozone phase the impacts of a bird on, of ozone on a bird. We were working actually on vineyard, with vineyard, and in the first year we were unable to assess the yield because someone got all our berries. So we insisted and performed the other 2 years experiment, and finally we found the responsible, and it's this magpie, and it was a very nice experiment because we involved also zoologists, so it was a really transdisciplinary approach. And finally we discovered that magpies don't like ozone in the air. Probably they have the capacity to smell it in the air. We tested the quality of the berries. We tested several hypotheses, but finally it's just ozone in the air. Another point which is of interest for ozone research is the impacts on the emission of volatile organic compounds. So you may know that leaves have the capacity of emitting, in particular, isoprene and monoterpenes. This is very important when we select species, especially in the urban areas, because urban areas are low in VOC and high in nitrogen oxides. So when we add some volatiles, we have the capacity of produce a high amount of ozone. So in the cities that are nitrogen limited, nitrogen oxide limited environments, we have to select the species very carefully because species differ in their capacity of emitting volatile organic compounds. So for urban greening, it's better to select species that emit low amount or even no VOC rather than species emitting high quantities of these substances because they are bad for the air quality that we breathe. In fact, we know that trees are always beneficial in the cities, but in terms of air quality, they absorb CO2, ozone, nitrogen oxides, particulate, but emit these volatile organic compounds. We developed a model and tested this model for 220 species in my city, Florence, and the model is called Trees from Florence. Sorry for this chauvinism. And in very short, there are some species that are the best ones to be used in the cities when the city is polluted with ozone or nitrogen oxide, and these are maple, ash, tilia, fagus, and rather we recommend to avoid these species, the majority of oaks, poplar and eucalypts, also willow, because they emit really large amounts of volatile organic compounds. So in conclusion, our knowledge of ozone pollution impacts on terrestrial ecosystems has improved very much over time, but is still imperfect, especially about impacts on biodiversity, BVOC emission, nutritional imbalances, and below-ground responses. And ozone phases can really help us to understand what's happening under real-world conditions, and the focus must be now on stomatal ozone fluxes, POD, and we hope to have more and more collaboration, especially with Slovenia. So thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? Elena, just something very organizational. How long did it take to get this modification of the European regulation?
Oh, it took a life.
It started with Paul Jarvis in 1979.
Yes. It took a life, basically. So we were very surprised when finally it got implemented.
So it was 20, 30 years?
Yes, it was basically, thank you, ICP vegetation in particular, yes. They were able, within the umbrella of the United Nations Economic Convention of Europe and the Long-Range Transborder Air Pollution Convention, which established ICP vegetation, ICP forest. So it was a process started, I think, in 1970-something. So very long indeed. Rather in China, say, I see they are much faster. And yes, I teach for 6 years in China, just 1 month a year, not for 6 continuous years, in order to stimulate the formation of a new generation of young scientists that can push local politicians towards the right direction. And I'm proud to see that we already see some results. And, you know, China is the top polluter in the world. But since 2015, the emission of nitrogen oxides has peaked and is now decreasing. So it seems that things are working, and hopefully not so slow like in Europe. Thank you for your question.
You showed us there are rather high emissions of ozones in Africa, especially.
Yes.
It's also the pollution the main reason for that, or anthropogenic?
Yes, unfortunately, these pollutants are everywhere, really everywhere, because they are transported also in the high circulation of the atmosphere. So they are transported from one continent to another continent. We are sure about that. And in Africa, there is a lot of pollution, especially in the cities, because the traffic is unregulated. They use any kind of fuel, and that's a real problem for people's health. And Europe is starting now to support some programs for helping African cities to develop sustainably. And of course, also this kind of consideration are very important. We would be happy to start a monitoring program in different cities. We tried several times, so far unsuccessfully. But Africa is really the place to work with nowadays.
And also monitoring, regular monitoring that's going on in a lot of countries, or is this just limited on some?
Yes, so we were in a group led by United States scientists that developed this TOR database, which is the database collecting all the data of ozone from all over the world. And there it was clearly, it was easy to see where are the gaps. And the gaps are Africa is basically unknown, and some parts of Southeast Asia, say also India, not so much, and Thailand starting now, and also in China, rather, they have a fantastic system. The data were not public, available, but now they are, so things are changing, as I said. And in South America, unfortunately, South America is suffering a lot of issues, also because of pollution. You know, the issues of the Amazon forests, and there too we would need to implement a very good monitoring system. Some countries are more active, others are definitely not in the system.
But you cannot use the satellites to determine or you can?
Well, very recently someone developed an approach, still to be validated, but it's promising. Actually, remote sensing is doing amazing progress in many fields, so maybe here too. Obviously, there is a lot of noise in the column of ozone because of particulates, because of other gases. So still the system is not efficient, but it would be very brilliant indeed. So far we have either biomonitoring, using plants that are known to be very sensitive, which is also helping people to see the injury so that they are emotionally involved. Or, of course, active monitoring by sensors. And when we started this job, one sensor was probably 20,000 present euros. Now you can buy one with 5,000, an excellent one, or low-cost sensors that are not excellent, but maybe used under these difficult conditions. They are powered by solar panels, and the price of solar panels now is very low relative to the past, and they can send the data directly to your laboratory by GPS connection if available, and usually if your cell phone is working, you can transfer your data. So we are making fantastic progress, and hopefully we can develop a monitoring system also in the areas that are at higher risk.
You know, I'm a historian, I don't know.
Okay. I tried to explain what are the stomata.
One common question. When we're talking about forests, what are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges you're dealing with? Deforestation or pollution?
Deforestation is not an issue in Europe, of course. I mean, it's still an issue in some countries, especially in Eastern Asia, in Brazil, in parts of Africa still. In Brazil, under Bolsonaro, unfortunately, deforestation restarted. Now, under Lula, things are improving. So as usual, when people ask me how to fight climate change, I say, think about who you are voting for, because that's a political issue, so it's important to vote for people that believe in science. And for Europe, the main issue for forest at present is for sure climatic changes, abrupt climatic extremes. Think about insect outbreaks, or wind storms that we recently have in several areas, wildfires that are now also in Nordic countries, in Siberia, in Sweden. So it's not only a Mediterranean issue. So these are for sure the most serious issues.
So you have shown a slide about the impacts of ozone on biodiversity. You only mentioned, well, we know about something about below ground.
Yes.
You mentioned magpies.
Yes, I mentioned magpies because we had a great fun.
Yeah, but what other?
Insects, for instance. Yes, insects, herbivores, but also pests, pathogens. We still don't know enough. But for instance, we know that ozone is dehydrating vegetation. So there may be an impact on capacity to burn easier. That's something unexplored. Also, the complex relationship with the emission of volatiles are absolutely not clear, because volatiles are emitted not only by leaves but also by roots, so from the soil, and in particular the impacts on microbiology is basically unexplored. We recently made an analysis, but I don't have the results on the impacts on the phyllosphere. We expect ozone is
Corrosive, basically.
well, it's used to clean water, to remove microbes from the water. So I may expect the impact on microbial communities is very strong. And this also means a network of other events, because this phyllosphere community obviously has a beneficial impact on the capacity of the leaves to act. So that's unexplored.
You showed about New York City environment. Is the same situation in China as well?
Well, China, data are complex because ozone concentrations are high also in the cities. And in addition, ozone pollution overlaps with particulate pollution. Rather, in our conditions and also in North America, there is a season for pollution, for ozone, summer, and a season for particulate, winter. Rather, in China, they have both, often at the same time. It's very difficult conditions. But as I said, things are improving, and are improving very fast. So maybe what I'm saying now, it's already old.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.